Good evening, everybody. We just want to let you know that there is a whole front row. If you feel like joining us down the front, you're very welcome. If this is your first time at Petersham Bowling Club, welcome to Readers, Books and Conversation. If you are a repeat visitor, welcome back to Readers, Books and Conversation. My name is Michaela Kalowski, and it is a delight to be with you tonight and to have the wonderful Francesca de Tores with us to talk about mostly female pirates. But we're having a Sydney Writers' Festival party. We are in collaboration with Sydney Writers' Festival, so it's lovely to be together tonight. I wanted to also acknowledge that we are on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of the land, and to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us this evening. I'm going to chat with Francesca in the usual fabulous way. No, for 45 minutes, and then at the end there will be time for your questions, and we'll have a roving mic so you can stay exactly where you are. You will have noticed on the way in the lovely Gia from Berkeley Books in Leichhardt. I think many of you have bought books, which is fabulous. She didn't bring quite as many, we didn't receive as many as we wanted, so buy them all out, and if for some reason they sell out, you can leave her your email or your number and she will call you when the book is in stock, so we hope no one misses out. Tonight we're going to discuss Mary Read and Anne Bonny, two extraordinary women who are real historical figures and also characters in this new novel called Saltblood. I'm going to ask Francesca to try and help us puzzle out why we love pirates so much and what we admire about them. We're going to talk about what it's like to write historical fiction, the detail of life on the high seas, life on board ships in the 1700s, and of the political machinations of kings and governments at that time. We're also going to talk about gender. Mary Read lived half her life as a boy and then as a man. Equality between men and women, queerness, and what gets left out in the retelling of some histories, and what fiction might be able to reinstate. I want to tell you a little bit about Francesca, and then we will dive in. Francesca de Tores is the author of 4 previous novels. The most recent, The Cookbook of Common Prayer, was published in 2021. Her post-apocalyptic Fire Sermon trilogy was a huge hit. It was published in more than 20 languages, and film rights were optioned by DreamWorks. Those novels were The Fire Sermon, The Map of Bones, and The Forever Ship. She's also the author of poetry. Her most recent collection of poetry is called Bodies of Water. There's a theme going on. We've got to get to that. And her poetry is widely published in literary journals and anthologies in both Australia and England. She grew up in Tasmania, Lutruwita. She got her PhD from the University of Melbourne, and she was a senior lecturer and a visiting writing fellow at the University of Chester in England. And after many years living in England, she's back in Australia in Melbourne, and it is a delight to have her here this evening. Please join me in making Francesca de Tores very welcome. So, Francesca, as I've been saying over and over again, because I'm so excited to talk about them, this book is about female pirates. It is about it's about a lot of things, and it's about Mary Read's calling to the sea, and it's about a lot of things, but I wanted to start by asking you, when we think about all the elements in the book, it's got power and politics, it's got decisions made by governors in America in the New World, it's about piracy that flourished in that ecosystem. It feels like a story that could have taken many different forms. Why did you choose historical fiction?
I never intended whatsoever to venture into historical fiction. It seemed like a lot of hard work. And because I'd worked as an academic for years, I'd had enough of research and footnotes, having to keep track of sources. It all seemed much too complicated. But I stumbled across, in a really lowbrow way, through doing a horrible histories jigsaw with my son, stumbled across.
Isn't that a great origin story?
I wish it was something really academic and credible, but it's not. It is what it is. But I defy any of you here tonight to sort of try to get more than halfway through the Wikipedia article for Mary Read or Anne Bonny and not just become obsessed with these extraordinary women, which is exactly what I did. And so I fell down this rabbit hole, and it turned out that actually writing historical fiction is not a lot of work if it becomes your sole obsession for many years, which it did. So the challenge for me was then to know where to stop researching and to say enough. I now know enough about 1700s rigging in Navy ships. It's time to commit.
Can you know enough about that?
Never enough. So I had no intention of turning to historical fiction, but it sort of happened upon me, and I'm so glad it did. And interesting side note, my father was a historian and my mother was an English teacher, so it's a great way of keeping both of them happy.
Absolutely. Which is a very important part of life for a novelist, I think. I wanted to ask you about Mary Read as the historical figure. What's known of her?
Really very little, and it's sort of extraordinary that we even still know her name today, because she only pops up 3 times in all the historical records. So obviously there's a huge wealth of information about piracy, about the golden age of piracy, about the socio-historical machinations of the time. But her name pops up once in a list of names in a 1720 proclamation from Woodes Rogers, the then governor of Nassau, which was the pirate capital, the capital of the Republic of Pirates, as it was known. And he lists the crew that were involved in the theft of a ship called the William in 1720. Then we have a trial transcript, and I'm not spoiling the ending. I mean, A, it happened 300 years ago, but also, crucially, these women, Anne Bonny and Mary Read, the only 2 documented female pirates of piracy's golden age, they had one more trick up their sleeve even at this point. So I'm not spoiling the ending by saying that there was a trial. And then that's it in terms of contemporary references. Then a few years afterwards, we have this extraordinary book called The Short Version is a General History of Pirates, by a dude called Charles Johnson, Captain Charles Johnson, which is by no means his real name, and that's never been known. Some people have tried to argue that it was Daniel Defoe, but that's not an entirely convincing argument. And he wrote this juicy, salacious collection of accounts of the major pirates of the time, which included Bonny and Read. And it's a banging story, but the minute you read it, you think, oh, no. He's definitely, he loves it a little too much, and he enjoyed it so much, and it was so successful that a few years later he brought out a 2nd edition in which the stories were even more salacious. So you really have to take everything that Charles Johnson says with a pinch of salt. So really there's vanishingly little in the solid documents about them. If I were a historian, that would be a nightmare. As a novelist, it was great.
But the part of Mary Read's life where she did live for a period of time, both as a boy first and then as a man, that's part of the historical record?
It's included only, the only person that goes into her life before piracy is Charles Johnson. And so I was initially very hesitant to believe that, because I thought Charles Johnson as if. There is no documented record of her serving in the Navy and Army, but what I discovered through my years of research is that we do have at least one historical precedent that is documented of a woman doing exactly that. So there's an extraordinary woman who really deserves a novel of her own. I'm not going to write it, but I invite you to. Her name was Kit or Christian Davis, aka Kit Walsh, Mother Walsh, or Christian Kavanagh. She went by many names. And she had done exactly what Mary Read is claimed to have done. She ran off to war in her case because she was in search of a straying husband. And she served in not one but 2 wars, including the war in which Mary Read served, the War of Spanish Succession. She was only discovered after she was badly injured in the Battle of Ramillies, and the surgeon who was sort of piecing her skull back together said, by the way, this is a lady. So we do know that this kind of thing did actually occur. I mean, people whose relationship to gender is complex, trans people, genderqueer people, have always existed. And in fact, the response to these people at the time was in many ways much more charitable than what we're seeing today with this kind of confected moral panic about trans people. So the story of Kit Walsh got a huge amount of coverage. It was a sensation. And she was awarded a pension from the army. And it was seen as a kind of jolly jape story rather than some kind of scandal. So we don't know for sure that Mary Read did the things that Captain Johnson claims she did, but I don't think that history shows that they couldn't have happened.
So I want to give people a taste of it, because the book only came out in Australia 2 weeks ago. So at the very beginning of the book, Mary Read has been born to a mother who's living in abject poverty, who is not a loving person, and the circumstances are very hard. Tell us what decision her mother makes that kind of changes the course of Mary's life.
So Mary Read was born as the illegitimate child to this woman whose husband had either died or run away to sea. She had a son to her husband who died just as Mary was born. So Ma, who in the Saltblood version of Mary's story is truly a nightmare, and as someone who often feels that they're failing as a parent, I feel better about my parenting when I compare myself to Ma.
She is a shocker.
She's a shocker.
Yeah.
Though I hope that we understand why she makes the choices that she makes,
we do.
because her road has not been an easy one, but still, absolute nightmare. And she decides to pass young illegitimate Mary off as her brother, which solves the problem of her having got knocked up really quickly by someone that wasn't her husband, and also means that she can continue to claim from her former mother-in-law the allowance that belonged to her dead son. So Mary is raised to be Mark. She says at one point, you know, I was never given anything, not even a name. She had to live in her brother's name like his cast-off clothes. So she's raised as Mark. And even after the allowance stops coming in and her ostensible grandmother dies, Ma decides that she will make more money as a footman. So Mary goes into service as a footman, and from there into the Royal Navy and the Army.
And these incredible sections of the book, all the way through, that Francesca gives us, of Mary talking about what she observes by being dressed as a boy, dressed as a man, and the space she's allowed to take up. Can you talk a little bit about that notion of she doesn't feel like she's a boy, but she lives as a boy, and she makes very interesting observations that never felt like you were trying to superimpose something from today on Mary that's set in the early 1700s. Can you talk a little bit about how she sort of viewed her own sense of self or sense of gender?
Yeah, I'm very pleased to hear you say that it doesn't feel like an imposition of our contemporary views on someone living in, you know, she was born in 1685, so, and growing up in the early 1700s, because we've all read those books, those sort of revisionist feminist retellings of either myth or history, where what you have is some kind of contemporary 21st century proto-feminist who's plopped back into a period hundreds of years ago and spouts all these ideas, which we very much, you know, heartily agree with and endorse, but simply weren't in circulation, wouldn't have been available as concepts, let alone as vocabulary at the time. But I did feel, and this may be a case of me giving myself a huge get-out-of-jail-free card, I did feel that Mary was bound to reflect upon the different ways that she experiences the world, living as a man and living as a woman, because she got to do both, which is an incredibly unusual experience. So that I hoped that it wasn't too contrived to have her reflecting on what it was like, and on the ways that she found the world reacted to her when she was a man, that she was able to take up space in a way that wasn't apologetic. And it's an experience that those of us who present to the world as women very much know, that if a man in a crowded bar wants to move you aside, he will, for reasons best known to himself, put his hands on your hips and move you to the side, perhaps on the waist, perhaps on the bra strap. So, you know, Mary has these experiences. She notices that people move out of the way when she's a man and that they don't when she's a woman. So she thinks, I hope she has an organic justification for reflecting on these things.
All the way through the book, Mary's called to the sea, and she doesn't know whether she's trying to think about a connection to a father she never knew. But as soon as she can sort of free herself from being a footman in this very schmancy house of a French widow, where she does learn a lot about power and relationships between people, she enlists as a man, as Mark, in the Navy. And I love these scenes on this ship, sort of what she observes and what she learns to do. But how does she suddenly find herself in her element? How does she discover that that's really the place she's supposed to be?
So I think the more I learned through my research about the Royal Navy, the more I learned what a complete shit show it was. I mean, the level of physical deprivation was extraordinary.
That's an academic term, by the way.
That is the correct academic term. You were far more likely to die of illness than you were of, being in battle with the enemy. This is the War of Spanish Succession. So England and its allies up principally against the Spaniards, who also had a very strong navy. And you would get scurvy. If you didn't get scurvy, you might be beaten to death by a mad, entitled captain. Discipline was arbitrary at best and vicious at worst. Conditions were atrocious. And then there was the actual spectre of, battle and cannon fire.
And of accidents that can happen on a ship.
Accidents, yeah. So it seemed to me that for Mary to have lived so much of her life, and at this stage she's no longer under the thrall of Ma, she's making these choices for herself, which is a crucial change. For her to have lived so long in the Royal Navy and subsequently to have been drawn back to live in her later life, and we'll get to that, as a pirate, she had to be getting something. And for me, that had to be a passion for the sea. And maybe that's because I grew up, as you mentioned, in Lutruwita, Tasmania, so I'm a proper island girl. Islands pop up in all my books uncontrollably. And my brilliant agent, Juliette, said when she was reading an earlier draft of the novel, she was pointing out that I'd perhaps waxed lyrical a bit too much about the sea. And she said, "Gee, Francesca, if only we knew how Mary felt about the sea, if only there was some way that we could find out if she likes it. So the version that you encounter if you read the book now is that actually like that's the ocean light version. But I did feel that Mary and I had that very strongly in common, and that in order to survive these deprivations and to make the choice to be there and then to choose it again with piracy, she had to love the sea. But I mean, conditions in the Royal Navy were so bad that when they docked and came in for shore leave, the sailors were very rarely granted shore leave until the very end of their commission, which could be months, if not years, when they were sort of paid off. Because they would abscond in huge numbers, even though they would lose potentially years' worth of pay. So they were denied shore leave and kept on the boat because conditions were so atrocious that a vast number would desert.
Just leave. Yeah.
For the same reason they would allow sex workers to come out because they were terrified. The quote is that they would resort to sodomy. So they would ship sex workers out in huge numbers to the moored ships rather than let the men go ashore because they knew the men would desert because conditions were so appalling.
The sections of the book where Mary is sort of learning out who she is and what she can do in the world are extraordinary. This beautiful description of Mary standing on the very top of the masts, as Francesca writes, watching the sea swallow the sun, seeing her first sunset in the middle of the ocean. It's just astounding. And Mary continues this path. She leaves the Navy eventually and joins the army. And she can't really ride a horse, and she's still dressed as a man, and there's the Spanish War of Succession's going on. But she meets someone who becomes a kind of a friend to her and then more. Tell us about that relationship between Mary and Dan, the person she meets in the army.
Well, we do know, according to Captain Charles Johnson, that she moved from the Navy to the army and that she married a Flemish soldier. And so in Saltblood's version, this is Dan, who recognises Mary, desires Mary, but doesn't know for certain that Mary is a woman. And in all the historical texts, you have these fascinating moments when queerness arises and then is put firmly in its place. So Johnson says again and again, Mary was dressed as a man, someone fancied Mary, a man fancied Mary, when she's ostensibly a man. So this prospect of queerness arises, and then Johnson always says, then she showed him her boobs, basically. He
so romantic.
Very romantic. And so that it's safely reconciled. Okay, phew, it's all safely heterosexual, and the spectre of queerness goes away. But what's fascinating, at least in the version that unfolded in my head, was that Dan and Mary were never closer than they were when they lived in that liminal state of uncertainty. Because once he knows for certain that she is a woman and that revelation is made and they leave the army and are married, they then have to adopt the gender roles that society insists upon, which Mary finds very restrictive. And even he, though he can't admit it to himself, finds restrictive. They can never have that same easy camaraderie that they had when they thought they were both men, but he can never admit that to himself because that would condemn him for a sodomite, as the phrase was back then. So there's a great sort of sadness in their marriage because they can never again achieve the really special relationship that they had when she occupied a much more uncertain gender space.
It's kind of like this very organic definition of equality. They could just be and work together and love each other and respect each other and learn from each other. It's a beautiful part of the book. There's one character that we haven't talked about, which is that when Mary is on the boat, it comes up a bit later, she starts to be followed by a crow. And when you're on a ship, a crow is considered sort of bad luck. It's considered a bad omen. But crow becomes an absolutely central part of Mary's life. Why did you put the crow in there? What is the crow kind of there to do for us?
The crow actually comes in slightly later actually, after Dan's death. Again, I'm not too worried about spoilers because 300 years. But the crow is really key, and it's far and away, I say in a little historical note at the end, I give the references and I invite people to look further, because I think if you've read a juicy historical novel, you have that impulse to Google and to find out what was real and what wasn't. So I do try and lay out what was sheer speculation on my part. And the crow was the most kind of bonkers, far-out thing that just popped into my head. So one day this crow alighted in the draft and wouldn't go away. But I think the reason for it is that Mary is by necessity rather self-contained. She's the opposite of me. I'm extrovert, oversharer. And even if she were, she can't possibly be, because her survival depends on her passing for a man for so many years of her life. So she is by definition forced to be very self-contained. and no one sees her. You know, Dan sort of sees her.
Yes.
And he thinks he's seen the truth of her when she's, you know, exposed as a woman, but actually that's not the truth of her, because the truth of her is not just a woman, because she's more than that. So the crow, who becomes this kind of silent witness who accompanies Mary throughout the rest of her life, you know, often arousing the suspicion of fellow sailors and pirates, because it's an innately creepy thing. I mean, it's this hulking, black, terrifying bird. But it's this witness, and it sees her. And she says a crow cannot lie. So a crow sees and can only see truly. And it becomes a hugely significant part of her identity that she's accompanied by this crow, because the crow is the one true witness that she has throughout her very multiple and complex life.
I think it's something that Francesca just said, that it's so interesting to be with a character the whole way through a novel who's very introverted. By virtue of how she has to live, she is hidden. She's hidden from the world, and she's a bit hidden from herself, but she does know herself. And the experience you have in reading the novel is of her kind of coming into her own fullness, literally. And some of that is being able to live as a woman, but it really happens when she becomes a pirate, when she has this kind of enormous agency. So let's go to the pirate part of things. I want to ask you firstly that $64 million question. Why do we still love pirates? It seems to me we've never stopped loving pirates. Children love them. There's National Speak Like a Pirate Day. They've never sort of been out of fashion. What is it about pirates?
I think it's a very subconscious urge, because if we try to rationalise it, we struggle, right? We think, well, there are lots of other kinds of criminals. We don't love identity thieves or drunk drivers. You know, what is it about pirates in particular? No. I think often what we love about pirates has very little to do with the reality of what pirating was like, because, and again, this is a big spoiler, that Pirates of the Caribbean is not a documentary. The more I learned about pirate life, the more astonished I was. And I felt sort of sad, because I felt like, on the one hand, I wanted to show people the truth, that they didn't tend to bury treasure, that they were very rarely capturing giant galleons loaded to the gunwales with gold. It was very often, you know, a fishing canoe with its fishing gear and fish.
Yeah. Well, they find some lime juice at one point.
Yeah, lime juice
fascinating.
Is worth more
it's
than
worth
rum.
more than rum.
Because of scurvy.
Yeah.
So, you know, often their existence was much more prosaic and mundane and sort of grubby than the romantic notions of piracy would have it. So I was, in some ways, I thought, am I not going to give people what they want of piracy if I give them the real version? But also it was more fascinating in many ways than the romanticised version that we attach ourselves to. But I think there is something innately fascinating about the sheer audacity of the rule breaking. I mean, these small-time criminals, and that's what they were in the large part, were violent criminal men, often on a very small scale. But they became a thorn in the side of empire. They really had a disproportionate impact. That's why there was this tremendous crackdown against the golden age of piracy, led by Governor Woodes Rogers, who moved out to Nassau in 1718 and led this crushing of what remained of pirates. So I think we're very drawn to these mavericks, these rule breakers. It's like the line from every single cop in a buddy cop film, you know, I'm a maverick, but I get results. That they were fearless, they were bold, they were resolute, they didn't follow the rules. And I think that becomes amplified when they're breaking the rules on lots of different levels, because for Anne Bonny and Mary Read, the only two documented female pirates to have done this. And I say female, obviously their relationship, because Anne Bonny had also, for different complicated reasons, been raised as a boy for many years of her life.
Wow.
So their relationship to gender was obviously very complex, but biologically female at least. So they're breaking rules on multiple levels, and that's so entrancing to us. And I think particularly for women who are still find ourselves under the imposition of so many rules and gender expectations, things have come a long way since 1685 when Mary Read was born, but in many ways they haven't come far enough.
No, absolutely. I want to ask you about Anne Bonny, but I also want to give people a sense of the language that you use in this book, because it is sumptuous. It's prosaic, it's lyrical. I mean, I said before, Francesca was a poet first, and when you read this book, you will understand that connection in her writing. Why when you decided to write, you know, your other books were they for young adults? Your trilogy?
The initial trilogy, the Fire Sermon trilogy, was sort of young adult, although it was more marketed at young adults than necessarily written for young adults, because it came out in the time that the Hunger Games was huge. Yeah. And so if you were a youngish, as I was then, a million years ago, female author who'd written something dystopian, you were put very firmly in the young category. Adult box. Yeah. But I think my language has always tended to skew a bit more lyrical. So my sweet 10-year-old son, when I suggested a year or two ago that he was probably old enough, he'd read The Hunger Games, if he wanted to read the Fire Sermon, he could. He said, "Oh, I don't know, Mum, are you one of those writers who likes to describe everything?" And I had to say, yeah, you know what, it's a fair cop, I kind of am. But I do feel very often that there is, in the way that we talk about language, in the way that language is often praised these days, it's praised in terms that are kind of reminiscent of the fatphobic language that we see. It's the language that is held up as the ideal is spare and stripped down and lean and all these kind of skinny terms. And sometimes I think, well, why can't language also be luscious and Rubenesque and Baroque? Why is this the metric by which we're now measuring language and its success? So I'm quite happy to let my poet flag fly sometimes and unroll a few metaphors as I go.
It's fascinating to hear you say that. I wonder if those depictions of the language that's the proper literary language being lean and sparse is a kind of a masculine way of talking about language, and the sumptuous and the prosaic and the lyrical or the florid, the emotional. It's really what we're getting at is that there's writing that makes you feel. It's full of Francesca's writing it's bodies, it's visceral, it is very emotional. And I think about authors like Trent Dalton who get hammered with, "Oh, it's so emotional." It's like, it might be better for people to say, "I don't like feeling things when I read." But we don't say that. We point a finger at them and we're like, "Oh, it's not right writing," And I wonder if you have any thoughts on that as well. I mean, you're an academic and you do work in English literature, where that's a gendered way of also thinking about language.
Well, I do think almost invariably when we see a value judgment that's held up as objective and just the way things are, it very rarely stands up to scrutiny, and there is so often a gendered element. So we see whole genres that are loved by women, for example, historical fiction amongst them, that is seen as stereotypically a female genre, and we see that very often dismissed. And when a brilliant book comes along in that genre, it's often said to transcend genre, which means it's absolutely a historical novel, but you just think it's good, and that's a shock to you somehow. So I often think
decoding reviews now.
Yeah.
I love it. Yeah.
I think women have always been seen, and women's tastes and passions have often been seen as extra, as superfluous, as surplus, and it's worth sometimes unpicking those value judgments because they're very rarely objective.
That's very true. Thank you for saying that. I wanted to ask you about this notion of the golden age of piracy, just because we've got a sort of a piracy expert here. What do we mean by that term? What had come before and what ended it?
Well, the golden age of piracy actually covered a long period. The period within the golden age of piracy that I'm focusing on is the post-War of Spanish Succession period. And it's a fascinating time because pirates had been they had operated, and they have always operated, and they continue to operate now. But they had become a growing problem because with the end of the War of Spanish Succession, you suddenly had the Royal Navy bankrupted. So thousands of sailors were suddenly out of work. You have privateers, which is a kind of legalised pirate. That's a kind of a private vessel, not a Royal Navy vessel, that gets a letter of marque, which is a piece of paper from the monarch that says, "We're at war with Spain. Go and attack some Spanish ships, and that's fine. You're not pirating because you've got this piece of paper." And so suddenly privateering is also off the menu because we're not at war. You're not allowed to attack the enemy vessels because there is no enemy for the brief periods when these countries weren't at war, because they very promptly were again. So suddenly you have thousands of unemployed men who are sailors and who have one skill, which is attacking other ships and stealing their stuff and killing some people. So it's not really surprising that we saw a huge boom in piracy there. But it becomes a real problem for the colonial project because pirates were like fish. They go north when the weather permits, and when it gets frozen up the east coast of America, they head south and they go to where the money and the valuable cargoes are. And at this time in the Caribbean, these are tobacco and sugar and tobacco money and sugar money and often enslaved people, all linked to those crops. So there's an entire project of wealth and profit being produced off the back of the work of enslaved people and the money from the New World making its way back through the Caribbean, through the Windward Passage, back to the Old World. So when pirates really begin targeting that, it becomes a genuine problem. A, because it's a threat to the profits, but also it's turning off colonists and colonisers from settling in the New World. So it becomes a massive problem, and that's when Woodes Rogers leads the crackdown and ships himself out to Nassau, which was the capital of the Republic of Pirates, and begins to crack down. And there is a pardon, which was called the Act of Grace, where King George said, if you're a pirate, you've been very naughty, but if you turn yourself in, we'll give you a pat on the back and a free pass, and you won't be hanged. So suddenly, and there were rewards involved, so suddenly every pirate crew becomes a nest of suspicion, because these guys are in it for the money. They, by a large part, are not true believers in the Republic of Pirates. There's some kind of emancipatory new society. It's very tempting to read the Republic of Pirates as this fantastic proto-democracy. There probably were some true believers, but a lot of these guys were privateers. They'd slipped into piracy. They were opportunists. They saw this and they thought, great, I'm free and clear. I won't be hanged. I can go home and build a little house with my reward money. So that was a devastating move for the pirate crews. Jack Rackham, who was the captain of the crew that contained both Anne Bonny and Mary Read, took the pardon. He did not stick to the pardon by any means, and so the story continues.
It's interesting as well, I hadn't thought as clearly as Francesca sets out in the book, that relationship between piracy and slavery. It's obvious, but the idea of pirates, as you said, that maybe one of the reasons we love them was that they're kind of, these rule breakers and they're, a thorn in the side of empire, but really all they are is leeching off the money that empire makes from slavery. And that's brilliantly it's there as a strand in this novel.
There's a quotation in one of the sources, and I'm sorry I can't remember exactly where it's from, where it says, pirates have no god but money. So there probably were true believers amongst the pirate community who really thought that they were building something new. And there were really emancipatory, interesting aspects within the Republic of Pirates. So one fascinating thing that I found, and again, this really undermines the kind of maverick, slapdash, anarchic view that we have of pirates, is that almost every pirate crew had its own articles, which is a very boring legalistic document that would stipulate, the member of the crew who first espies the prey shall have the best pair of pistols aboard, and the captain shall have 1 1/4 share, and the master shall have 1 1/8 share. Really boring, nitty-gritty stuff.
Accounting.
And you think, pirates? Contracts? What? But in some ways, these were far more progressive. So pirates had a say. The crew was quite a democratic institution, and they would get to elect their captain, whereas in the Royal Navy, where Mary had served earlier, you would absolutely swing from the yardarm if you so much as breathed a word of dissent against your captain. So they were much more democratic. If you lost a limb, you'd get a far better pension from your pirate crew than you would in the Royal Navy. And it was very common to see freed former slaves working on pirate crews. And there are examples of pirate crews that would capture a ship containing enslaved people and would liberate the slaves. So it's very tempting to think, they were the good guys. Unfortunately, that just doesn't stand up to scrutiny. Unfortunately, there are many, many cases where they would capture a ship containing enslaved people and take them for themselves, enslave or sell them, or in some terrible cases, sink the ship if they didn't have room. So I think it's very tempting to read them as this wonderful progressive society. Unfortunately, as with almost everything in life, it was much more complex and often grubby, more grubby than that.
It's such a gift in this book, the way that Francesca's brought Mary Read to life. I mean, you could stay in this book just in the sections where Mary's working in a household. It's absolutely illuminating about how she sees the world and how she sees herself. But then in walks Anne Bonny, not one but two female pirates. Anne Bonny is a corker. She is a flame red-haired Irish lass whose father was a lawyer, and she is a rule breaker. All she wants to do, everything for her is a world of yes, whether you say yes or not. She is an absolutely wonderful character. Talk to us about bringing her to life and about putting her together with Mary Read, because they could not be more opposite. But as you say, Anne Bonny in real life was also raised for a time as a boy. Yeah,
so according to Charles Johnson, Anne Bonny was, again, an illegitimate child of her respectable lawyer father's affair with a maid in his house. And the father wanted to have his illegitimate child in his household but didn't want his wife to know, and so he passed her off as a young relative, a boy who was meant to be his law clerk. So it sort of beggars belief that these two women who became the only two pirates of this period were in different countries at different times. Bonny was considerably younger than Read, raised for different complicated reasons as boys, and that they should end up together on Calico Jack Rackham's crew. It's sort of beyond extraordinary, but it also means it seems there's a kind of inevitability about the way they're drawn to each other, because the parallels between their situation are so uncanny. But Bonny is so different. I think of Anne Bonny as she manifested to me in Saltblood as a woman of appetites. She's all id. For anyone that's ever dealt with a toddler, they want what they want, and they want it now. And for Anne Bonny, whether that's a lover, a feast, a prize of a pirate ship, she wants it all, and she wants it now. And she's grown up in this rather restrictive household of a wealthy father, and she marries a guy who says that he's a pirate and turns out to just be a bit of a faker and a bit of an informant. And that was James Bonny, and it says in the novel, James Bonny was a door and she walked right through him. She married him to get out of her father's house, but she got to Nassau and that was it. And my favourite line in all the research that I did, because these historical documents that I immersed myself in for years, yes, obviously they were invaluable and necessary for the facts, but it was also the language that they gave me, because I was so immersed in the language of the early 1700s. And Captain Charles Johnson describes Anne Bonny, whose nickname at the time was the Great Whore of New Providence. That's the island on which Nassau is now, the whole island is called Nassau, but back then it was New Providence. And he says, Anne Bonny was not altogether so reserved in point of chastity, which is just a wonderful, wonderful, very polite piece of slut-shaming.
Yes.
And I would
very
love to get it as a tattoo.
Shaming.
So classy.
Yeah.
So Anne was wonderful because she's the opposite of Mary. Mary, who's lived this secretive, self-contained life of survival, and Anne Bonny, who is all excess. And Anne Bonny, in many ways, is a nightmare and a selfish bitch. But she's also wonderful and vibrant, and what Mary gets from her is not necessarily what you or I would look for in a romantic partner, but what she gets is a sense that she's allowed to want what she wants, and she's allowed to desire. At one point she says, when she's wondering about the status of her relationship with Anne Bonny, because Anne Bonny is also married, according to a form of the law, to Jack Rackham, she says, I don't doubt what I have because desire is its own truth and does not lie. So it's about Mary Read coming to terms with her own desire and allowing herself that.
I mentioned before that a lot of this book is about bodies. There are these searingly kind of quite disgusting passages on the ship, where people have scurvy and their teeth are kind of just falling out like pegs. These brilliant descriptions of Anne's body, who has pregnancies, and of Mary's body as well, and of Mary tending to people at war or hiding herself. And I wondered why you chose to have that run all the way through the book. It sort of grounds the book in this really interesting way, and it is very visceral. Why did you include that? I mean, there's so much already in the story, but it's a very important part of it.
Yeah, I think it's really essential in historical fiction where the experience of the characters is so far removed from the experience of the contemporary reader. You know, we will never be a pirate from the early 1700s. We'll never work as a footman in a manor house. We'll never have those experiences. But the experience we do have is the grounded physical experience of embodied living. So I feel like if you're going to ask readers to take that leap in terms of such a distant experience, you have to ground it. You have to make it concrete for them through the body. And also, it's just so bloody fascinating because her experience, in my previous novel, I'd said after writing 3 quite adventurous dystopian novels, I want to write a book in which people sit in rooms having feelings. And that was the Cookbook of Common Prayer, a sort of adult literary novel, a novel I'm very proud of, but less adventure-based. And in this novel, I didn't have to work hard for plot because it was all there. I mean, the Wikipedia article alone could be a film script. It's so extraordinary. So the juicy stuff happens on the bodily level. And I very quickly realised that there was a difference between the kind of big H history, the big picture history, why we went to war for the War of Spanish Succession. And I had to know that. It was necessary that I be across all of that. But Mary herself barely knew that. Mary knows that she's at war and she wants to have a bigger, more expansive life, and that's her out from this very restrictive life as a footman in a house under Ma's thumb. So the experience that mattered much more to Mary in terms of her day-to-day lived experience was what kind of underclothes was she wearing? What did it feel like if you're in the Royal Navy at the end of your shift in the pitch black in a absolutely pissing storm? Are you wearing wool next to the skin? What does that feel like? How heavy does it get when it's wet? Those kind of small H history things became much more pressing to me and were much more significant in terms of Mary's day-to-day existence than what the hell was going on in meeting rooms in palaces amongst the upper echelons.
There's a wonderful section, Francesca writes, where Ma, when she first sends Mary off to work as Mark in this grand house, makes her a kind of a phallus out of cloth, and it's got beans in it, like heart beans, but after a period of time, because Mark's sweating and working, they start to sprout. And so Ma has to turn up with another kind of phallus. It's just fabulous and funny and weird. I wanted to ask you about research. I do have to ask you one research question, because you mentioned before that, terrible job if you're an academic, great if you're a fiction writer. But were there things you found where you were like, oh, this is just too weird, I can't include this because no one's going to believe it? Or were there things that you would have loved to include that you had to leave out?
No, I think I included most of the juicy stuff. I think what I had to let go was the detail because, and again, my brilliant agent, Juliet, called me at one point, having read an early draft, and said, Francesca, cut all that crap about the rigging. It's not Master and Commander. Now, I love Master and Commander. I would die for Captain Jack Aubrey. But I did have to distinguish between the things that I needed to know and the things that needed to make it into the final draft. And the most useful advice that I had about this was the wonderful author Sophie McIntosh, who wrote, it's not historical fiction, but the wonderful, what is it called? It was shortlisted for the Booker. It will come to me. Okay. Anyway, Sophie McIntosh uses this metaphor of the bay leaf, and she says you cook a meal and you put a bay leaf in it, but no one wants to chew down on the bay leaf on their plate. You fish it out before you serve it up.
Nice, lovely.
And so that applied really beautifully, I felt, to historical fiction, that it was necessary for me to know all this stuff, sometimes quite boring, dry, irrelevant stuff, but it didn't end up on the page. It would inform what ended up on the page, but all I needed to give ultimately was a sense that Mary knows what's going on with the rigging, but you don't want to know about all the bloody rigging. So it was for me a matter of taking out research rather than being sad and having to worry about what to put in. It was understanding how to be judicious about what to include.
And I should say, if it's not clear already, this whole novel is told in Mary's voice. So, there's no mediation between what she's experiencing and her. We're not seeing her from above, other than the crow, who's pretty freaky. But it's a beautiful way to experience standing on the top of a mast, or being on a battlefield, or falling in love, or, being a pirate. I wanted to ask you, I said to you before that we've talked before about the fact that you use language in a particular way, and when you were first starting out, you were a poet first. Why do you think that was the form you were drawn to?
I think poetry remains the most exacting form, and the bio that you read at the start was perhaps rather charitable because it referred to my latest book of poetry. Also, I feel I should say my only book of poetry. But I do still
supportive.
I do still write poetry. My great friend and the wonderful Australian poet Nathan Curnow and I, we exchange a poem once a month, and so in about 5 years I'll have another collection. So I love the exactitude of poetry. I love the way that you can agonise over every sentence, every line break. And I still feel in some ways that that's the ultimate distillation of writing, and that's what I'm interested in. We turn to poetry, everyone says, oh, they don't like poetry, they don't get poetry, and then someone you love dies and you find that what you want to read is a poem. Or that that someone reads a poem at the funeral and it absolutely flattens you and you wander around quoting Mary Oliver for the rest of the month. There is something in us that needs that ultimate distillation of language and meaning. So poetry remains, I think, the acme of language for me. But there are things that I can do in novels that poetry won't allow me to do in terms of sheer scope. And Saltblood, more than I think any of my other novels, is an expansive novel. It's a novel about standing on the top of the mast and seeing the curve of the horizon. It had to be big, and the language of it had to be big and bold. And it's a chonky boy. Every time I sit down to write a novel I intend to write, I think this one's going to be a tight 80K, a lean, slimmed down type, it turns out that's not me. And I send my agent another chonky boy of 120,000 words.
Thank goodness, I have to say. Well, we've got time now for your questions. I think we'll turn the lights on and there'll be a roving mic. And we'd love to hear from you any questions you have for Francesca. There we go. There's one in the corner. We'll bring you a little microphone.
I was too engrossed in what's happening.
Yeah.
Thank you. You talked about that slimness of language, but you also talked about the precision of poetry. So I'm kind of a bit confused because you're talking about how you love this expansive writing, but you love this really precise writing. So how does that work for you?
Poetry,
Lovely.
It's a very good question. Poetry has to be the best words, but the best words are not by definition the fewest. So sometimes the best words are a beautiful Baroque metaphor that might, go on for sentences and flower as you read it. So when I say the most distilled form, I don't mean the smallest form. I mean the best words in the best order, to quote that. I mean, I think often, poetry is, we look at a poem, it's this big on the page. We look at a novel, it's that fat. But some of the poems that I love the most are expansive. I'm thinking of the beautiful poem by Smart about his cat, Geoffrey, which goes on and on in the most fulsome metaphors about his cat. It's the kind of proto-Instagram post about a cat, but from hundreds of years ago. They are the best words, and there's lots of them. So, yeah, when I say the most distilled and exacting form of language, I don't necessarily mean in terms of scale. I just mean in terms of the amount of precision that is brought to bear on every word, however many there are. I hope that makes sense.
Thank you.
I'd like to project. You talked about research and starting novel. What was the overlap? Was there a point at which during the research you started writing it in your head and that drove your research? Or did you complete the research and then start the novel? What was the overlap?
There was almost 100% overlap. If it were a Venn diagram, it would kind of be a circle. So I am not capable of resisting the urge to write, and perhaps it's having tickets on myself and thinking that this is gold, I've got to get this down now. But I always find, every time, and this is my 5th novel, and every time I sit down to start a novel, I say, I will write this in chronological order, very neatly, and there will be no gaps to fill in at the end. And then you start researching Mary Read, and a crow pops into your head, and you're writing a scene 2/3 of the way through the novel where she suddenly begins to be followed by a mad crow. In the same way, it would have been really nice had I been able to stop researching at a certain point and devote myself entirely. I think I'm still researching and the novel's been published for some time. The one good thing about that is that I found myself so completely incapable of letting go of this period and this milieu that the book I'm working on now, and I'm 20,000 words in, is... I like to describe it as being in the Saltblood cinematic universe. It's about a character who pops up very briefly in here. It's Alexander Selkirk, who is the real-life Robinson Crusoe.
Wow.
Sort of grumpy bastard of a Scottish sailor who was abandoned through a series of his own very bad decisions on a remote island 600 miles off the coast of Chile for 4 years and 4 months. And after he was rescued by Woodes Rogers, the governor who goes on to lead the crackdown on the pirates of Nassau, becomes the model for Robinson Crusoe. So I'm so incapable of letting go of the research that I'm writing a whole other book just as an excuse to stay amongst my beloved papers.
I'm excited to read that one. We've got time for a few more questions. There's one down the front. Do you want to yell out and I can repeat it?
I've got a question about imagining the reader.
Yeah.
Because you see, you've lived with these two women so closely for so long, was there any sense that you were writing back towards them as people, or were you really just thinking of the imagined reader as us here today kind of people?
No, I don't think too consciously about the reader. It feels too contrived to do that. And maybe that's an affectation. Maybe, I'm sure subconsciously I'm thinking on some level about it. I'm always really wary when I talk about writing of anything that sounds a bit wanky, a bit transcendental, a bit woo-woo. I did find with this book that at some point I felt I owed a kind of loyalty to Mary, that when I initially started writing, my loyalty, the thing that I felt that I had to get right was these few facts that we knew, that she stole the ship the William in 1720 and that the trial was in later in that year, and this handful of facts. And gradually her voice became bigger and bigger in my head. I'm realising as I say this that I sound more and more unhinged. And I felt that my loyalty was to this sense of her as a character as she was emerging. And there was a very moving moment. I was, until last week, was in London for the UK book launch, and we went out for drinks after the big launch event, and my Italian translator, who's halfway through translating Saltblood, was there. And my sweet husband raised a toast and said, you know, to Francesca, as a good husband should. And my lovely Italian translator said, to Mary Read. And I found myself quite overwhelmed with emotion.
Wow.
And I was really, you know, I wish that I'd been the one to do that, but I was so glad that someone did. Because these women, it's incredible that we still speak their names, really, because they barely appear in the historical record. And yet what they did was so extraordinary. And this enduring fascination, the very fact that we still know their names. And much as my publicist would like it to be otherwise, I'm not the only novelist to write their story, and there will be more. So there is something about their story that is so universal and appealing. So I was very glad that we drank a glass to Mary Read that evening.
Wonderful. I've got one of those, you know, rebellious girls stories that you read to female children or any children, and those three pirates have a page each, Grace O'Malley and Bonnie, Mary Read, and that's how I first heard about them. It's like, there they are. They just, as you say, they stuck to us. I want to ask you one more question, though, which I didn't get to in a lot of detail, and it's like how do you write about writing? But you talk about your love of the sea and how much it's, you know, a part of you, and you know, the book is called Saltblood, and at one point that's what Mary Read says. She said, I think it's just in me, and I'm called back to it. And everywhere she goes, she's like, I'm like a river finding its way. It's a really beautiful description. Was it hard for you to bring the sea to life in the way that you did? Because it's like the heart of the book.
I mean, it's interesting when you read that biography of me at the start and you said the collection of poetry, which was published in something like 2006, was called Bodies of Water. And I thought, I'm still just writing the same book. I'm writing about bodies and I'm writing about water. So it didn't feel hard. I mean, if anything, the challenge was, as per my agent, to not overdo it. To not wax lyrical ad nauseum about the ocean. I don't know that someone who didn't love the sea and who hadn't grown up in Lutruwita, and you know, I swim in the river in the Birrarung River in Melbourne with a group of equally mad women called the Yarriyabbis. We swim amongst the E. coli, and I surf quite badly. I don't think someone who didn't love the sea could have written this book. But I didn't struggle. I just struggled not to bang on about it too much.
I love it. I think we probably have come to time. I'm so pleased that you did that horrible histories puzzle and learnt about Mary Read and Anne Bonny. Thank you for bringing them to such vivid life for us and for sharing them with us tonight. Please join me in thanking Francesca de Tores.